Before we begin, you can claim ACMPE, ACHE, CME, and CEU credit. And if you view the live session, you can claim AAPC, CPE, and CNE credit. Claim continuing education credits starting next week using the MGMA CEU portal. The code for AAPC credit will be emailed to you. Submit your questions, resources, and comments using this chat area. Slides and resources can be found in the lower left section of the previous session page. The education for this session will now begin. In today's session, Katie Lawrence, MHA, CMPE, and Director, Ambulatory Optimization and Integration at Prisma Health, will explore how practice leaders can address change in their organizations to become more successful in engaging team members, physicians, and other stakeholders. Katie, I know you've got a lot of great information to share, so I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, hello, and thank you for being with us today. I am excited to be talking with you about leading organizations through change. It's certainly something that has been a part of the healthcare industry for many years. We are no strangers to change, but I think this year more than ever, we have certainly been exposed to a whole lot of change in a whole lot of new ways. Today, we'll talk about leadership responsibilities in times of change and how team members might have different perspectives as we are going through a change initiative. And we'll talk about how we as leaders can analyze techniques for communicating change and helping our team members, our physicians, our advanced practice providers to accept those changes and to sort of roll with the punches as we move through changes and become better and better organizations and better at taking care of our patients. My name is Katie Lawrence, and I am the Executive Director of Ambulatory Optimization with Prisma Health. Prisma Health is a healthcare organization in Greenville, South Carolina and Columbia, South Carolina. We actually came together as a merger of Greenville Health System and Columbia's Palmetto Health to form one integrated health system about 2 years ago. My job on a day-to-day basis is to lead initiatives throughout our medical practices. We have over 250 sites and nearly 2,000 providers employed in our medical group. So change is not something that we are strangers to. It's certainly something that we have become very accustomed to within our organization. And yet at the same time, it still is something that we have to encounter with certain levels of intention and being ready for the changes at hand. One of the ways that our system changed several years ago was to add an accountable care organization. So we have a clinically integrated network in each of our markets, and our primary care physicians and even now our specialists are no longer strangers to quality care metrics. We look at things every month like depression screening and breast cancer and colorectal cancer screenings. We watch our A1C control for our diabetics, and we look at hypertension, which is one of the leading causes of death in South Carolina. So it was a little bit surprising when I found myself in February sitting in a physician practice management meeting with physician leaders and practice management leaders in the Department of Family Medicine. And one physician raised his hand and said, "You know, my medical assistant has done some research, and it looks like if one of my patients sees one of my partners when my patient is sick, if my partner doesn't take care of all of that patient's needs when it comes to health maintenance and care gaps, that my scorecard is getting dinged for that. Is that true? Am I held accountable to that?" And that was no surprise to me. That is, of course, how our scorecards have operated for the last 4 to 5 years. It's something we've communicated a great deal about. And my first reaction was, "What do you mean? Why are you asking this question? Of course that's how it works." But I realized as I looked around the room that this was surprising to many of our physician leaders and even some of our practice managers. They hadn't fully grasped how that scorecard worked. And so what I realized is that no matter how much we as leaders think that we have communicated something, sometimes It takes hearing it from a different perspective or from someone doing the investigation and really coming to terms and really grasping that concept before we can embrace that change. Now, I don't know about you all, but I don't typically have 4 years to come to grips with a change. Most of the time, most of our changes happen far more rapidly than that. So let's think about a few of those changes that have been impacting healthcare over the last several years. Some of those initiatives and aspects of our industry include consumerism. Our patients know more, they expect more, they are far more consumer savvy when it comes to healthcare. There are also mergers and acquisitions like the one I experienced with Prisma Health. And there are the ways that disruptors like Amazon Health and others who are new to the healthcare industry are changing the way that we deliver healthcare. So healthcare is no longer just our physician interacting with our patients and parents. It's much more than that. On a day-to-day basis, there is much more change going on. One of those changes that our organization has very much jumped into over the last 6 to 9 months has been telemedicine. So telemedicine are initiatives that I have led through and been a part of in our health system for a number of years, but we were very limited by our payers. Our payers simply put a lot of restrictions on the way that we handled and were able to provide telemedicine to our patients. The patient and the provider both had to be in a healthcare setting, for example, or it had to be in a rural area and outside of a metropolitan statistical area or MSA. And so we had to be very careful and cautious. Well, suddenly COVID hit and our payers were far more accepting of being able to pay for telemedicine. Certainly there were nuances in the way that they needed us to provide it or the way we needed to code it, but we learned those pieces. And I was excited and I was also scared. Because as much as my creative juices were flowing and I was energized by the opportunity, there were a lot of questions still. Would we be able to code it correctly? Would our providers embrace the opportunity to provide healthcare via a computer? Would our patients embrace it? Would our network infrastructure be available and ready to be able to provide that system and provide that backbone for the telemedicine platform without freezing or losing sound or losing connectivity? Or would we have lots of technical issues to overcome as well? Well, it turns out things went as expected, a little bit bumpy at first, and certainly smoother as time went on. And what I loved about this change was it was an opportunity for me to self-reflect. As a leader of change initiatives, I'm often bringing change to the forefront. I'm bringing change to practice sites and others in our health system and others in our medical group. I'm not usually the one for whom change falls into my lap unexpectedly. So this was truly an opportunity for me to say, what am I feeling about this change? Why am I feeling this way? And is what I am feeling helpful? Those are 3 questions that I think are really important for leaders to think about before they ever present a change to the people that they are leading through change. So before your team sees you presenting a change, you need to know yourself how you're feeling about that change. And perhaps why are you feeling that way? Are you frustrated? Are you angry? Are you overwhelmed? Are you excited? And why are you excited? Why should they be excited? And in many ways, is what you are feeling helpful? Because sometimes what we are feeling about a change is really helpful and really beneficial. And other times what we are feeling about a change is not at all helpful. And we need to set those feelings aside, not forever, but just for a little while. And to be able to know what I am feeling about a change, I need to know what to call that feeling. The research shows us that most individuals can say 3 things about what they are feeling. Of course, there's the very typical, how are you doing today? And we say, fine. But outside of just sort of a platitude of fine, people can use 3 words to describe themselves. They're either glad, sad, or mad. Very infrequently do we use more detailed words. But the truth is there are hundreds of words to describe our emotional state. They often fall into categories like anger, fear, sadness, envy, happiness. They fall into broad categories. But within those categories, there's a range of emotions. So if I'm talking about someone or if I'm feeling fear, I might be feeling a very minimal level of fear. Maybe I'm cautious or concerned. Or maybe I've noticed that my fear is growing a little bit and I might describe myself as being alarmed or nervous. Or maybe I'm very afraid of what might happen and I'm panicked or petrified. All of those are different words to describe not only the state of emotion I'm in, but how intense that emotion is for me. You'll notice that many of these buckets are kind of associated with negative emotions. But when I talk about emotions, I try very hard not to emphasize good or bad, positive or negative, because sometimes it's very appropriate to feel fear, and it's a good thing that we feel fear. Other times it's very appropriate and often a helpful thing to find sadness or grief to be what you're experiencing. The same with shame, guilt, anger, jealousy. But when we talk about a good emotion, we are typically talking about happiness and joy. And just the same as any of our other emotional categories, happiness and joy can have ranges too. So we can be calm or friendly. We might be a little more happy and describe ourselves as delighted or excited. Maybe we're really happy and we're ecstatic or elated about a change. So I want to talk about a change in your organization right now. I'm curious, and I hope you'll join me in the chat to talk right now for a moment about what you're feeling about a change that's going on in your organization. Maybe it's a change that you are in the middle of or something that's coming this fall. What is it that is changing in your organization, and what 2 or 3 words might you use to describe it? Are you using a low level and very even keel word that barely associates with the emotion? Or maybe it's a higher level emotional word. I encourage you to share that in the chat, and we'll talk a little bit live there. As we talk in the chat, I encourage you to also be listening because I'm going to keep moving through my slides. And we will certainly have time at the end of today's presentation for question and answer. So if you do have a question, please reach out, ask it in the chat box, and we'll make sure to cover it at the end. So the change reaction curve describes how most of us see change and experience change. I will point out that the change happens along this curve in this pictograph as being very even and spaced out. So denial equals resistance equals exploration equals commitment. But that's not typically how most of us go through a change. In some cases, we may spend 4 years, like my friends in family medicine, who went through denial and resistance. Maybe it wasn't active resistance, but they weren't fully aware of the change for 4 years. And then they quickly moved through exploration into commitment. Other times you might move quickly through denial and resistance right into that exploration and on to commitment. Each change is going to feel a little different, and each of those stages have different emotions that are attached and associated with it. So for example, when telemedicine rolled out in my organization, I had some physicians who were excited and elated about the change. Our psychologists saw a much lower no-show rate when they could offer telemedicine to their patients who maybe weren't excited about coming into a behavioral health office or maybe didn't feel like getting out of the house that day. They could still join their physician. Others of our providers really felt like if they weren't touching and feeling and being able to interact face-to-face in real life, that they weren't really providing healthcare, which certainly is a different perspective. And so they were more resistant to the whole change around telemedicine. So what exactly are a leader's responsibilities in times of change? I very firmly believe that leadership begins with self. And that's why you will always hear me talk about self and identifying your own emotional reaction, your own perception of change, your own place on that change reaction curve before getting into how you interact with team members. And I encourage you, whenever you are leading a change, to find yourself emotionally, find yourself on the curve before you interact with peers, before you interact with team members, and even physicians and advanced practice providers and other stakeholders, because it's important to know how you are showing up in that conversation. If you don't know where you are, it's really hard for you to be able to identify with someone else who may be in a different position or different place on that emotional curve. Once we've found ourselves on that curve, though, I believe that a leader's responsibility comes down to two big buckets. The first bucket is around psychological safety, and the second is around communication. So let's talk about psychological safety and what that means. Psychological safety is a sense of confidence that members of your team are not going to embarrass, reject, or punish you just because you've spoken up to ask a question or make a comment. It means that the people around you believe in you, or the people around you at the very least are not going to bully you or berate you. So a manager who has fostered a sense of psychological safety has a team that will gather around a table or gather around a Zoom screen and provide open conversation about what it means to lead a change initiative or what that change initiative is going to have for the team. There may be good ideas. There may be some ideas that you can't put in place, but nobody's idea is going to be crushed and disrespected. No individual around that team is going to be embarrassed, rejected. No one is going to be punished. So how do we go about doing that? As leaders, we can welcome feedback from the team. Be really inviting of feedback, because if it's not something you've ever invited before, it's not something your team is going to take on. Because if they have a negative comment, they might be fearful if they don't know that your reaction is going to be welcoming. So encourage that negative feedback. Ask for negative feedback. I was on a call yesterday and I started with negative. I said, we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. So let's talk about the ugly first, and then we'll move on to the bad and then the good. I want comments in each of these three categories, because inviting it specifically will create that sense of psychological safety where that team knows that you want to hear all of it. You can also round with your team members. Rounding is simply the act of having a meaningful conversation. This might look like a one-to-one meeting. It might be called rounding in your organization, but it's that opportunity to have specific time with your team. The thing I'd like to remember about having rounding sessions is it's different than having an open door policy. Many of us manage by open door, and certainly having an open door to your office when it's not distracting is a really good thing as a manager. But the problem with only having an open door policy is that you know, and I know, that there are going to be certain people who are always going to show up at your doorway. They're always going to have something to share, something to ask about. They're going to be your talkative individuals. And then there are going to be those team members who just sit back and do their job. They never come to you with questions or concerns. They keep their head down and keep things focused on the task at hand. Well, those individuals need to be engaged as well. They need to know that their voice counts. And if you're not making that effort as their leader to have that conversation with them intentionally, then it doesn't feel as welcoming when they are coming to the table. They're not as used to speaking up. So you can become someone that people trust by building these little things into the way that you interact on a day-to-day basis. So what does that look like in action? I want to tell you about Denise. Denise is a team member of mine, and she's a medical assistant by background. She's been a certified medical assistant for over 20 years and worked in all sorts of practices, primarily family medicine. Now Denise travels from among all of our practice sites, and she goes into the practice sites to ensure that they understand and they know what the best practices and the workflows and the easiest way that we have found to do certain things. Well, I don't know about you all, but that can feel like an audit to some people. It might feel like an audit to me if someone's coming to check and see if I'm doing my workflows the way that I'm supposed to be doing them. Denise, however, has a different approach. She goes into a practice with full awareness that individuals might see her as an auditor, and she tries to counteract that before she ever shows up. Because the team members know that she's a medical assistant. She has gained notoriety for not only her job, but for the way that she does it. So team members who are sitting around a table or who are interacting with her as a means of going about their day, as she is interacting with them in a way that is as least intrusive as possible, she's very calm and she doesn't interrupt, and she knows what it means to handle a large practice or a large level of patients, a high volume practice. She knows that not everyone can be interrupted and continue about their day, so she tries to be quiet and she tries to be behind the scenes, knowing what it's like to be in their shoes. But she also, before she ever gets there and before she ever kicks off a project with a work team, she does some investigative work. She finds out what they're doing really well. She starts with complimenting them. She starts by saying, I recognize the hard work that you put in. I recognize the things that make our patients happy, that make our patients safe, that make our providers feel safe in providing that care to our patients. I recognize the work that goes in. And that already begins to build a bridge of trust. So they not only know that she has been in their shoes, but they know that she cares, that they do good work. She's not coming to be negative. Because you and I have probably each worked for a manager who the only reason that we ever saw them, that they ever spoke to us, was to be critical. And that is certainly not who we want to be as leaders. We want to provide good feedback, constructive feedback. We want to provide insight to our team members, but not from a place of fear. And that practice, that ability to do these things on a day in and day out basis takes consistency. It's about doing those little things in and out all day long. And certainly we're going to each have a bad day. We're going to each have that day where we are not feeling like the most open and welcoming of negative feedback. But the more that we can do this from a consistency perspective, the more our team is going to build that trust around us. And so when people ask my opinion about leadership during times of change or even leadership during a crisis, my answer is always the same. Calm is contagious and consistency is critical. And in fact, the teams within my organization who have weathered this pandemic the best have been the ones where there was a real sense of psychological safety, of calmness and consistency within the practice. They weren't the ones who jumped to a fearful stance, who jumped to what's going to happen next, who had that sky is falling mentality. They were calm and they were consistent in maintaining as much the same as they could. Because as we embrace change, we also want to know what's staying the same. When I had my second job out of college, I had a boss who jumped out of planes for fun. So we spent a lot of time traveling and we were on airplanes for business. That meant that he was on airplanes both for business and for fun. So on the weekends, he was a parachuter and he would skydive and jump out of planes for fun. And on a particularly rough business trip, and rough by meaning the skies were rough, we were on a small plane flying into a very small airport, meeting a very small client in a very small town, and the weather was not super friendly. The plane had been bumped and bounced around from the larger airport to the smaller airport, and it was pretty clear by looking at my face or my body language that I hadn't weathered the storm all that well. In fact, when Ed looked at me, he said, "You don't look so good." And I asked him how he was maintaining his calm. And what he said was, "I don't get worried until I hear the worry in the pilot's voice." And the pilot on that flight had given us consistent, calm updates as often as he possibly could. So you and I are those pilots to our teams. As we lead a change initiative, it's important that we provide consistent messaging and we do it in a calm manner. So the second thing after psychological safety is communication. And I believe that all communication ought to start with a pause. Because if we don't pause before things come flying out of our mouths, then we are reacting instead of responding. Responding is really a much more productive way to interact with our teams. So you and I know what reacting looks like. Reacting is acting with that first emotional or reflexive impulse. It's coming from that amygdala part of our brain, that fight or flight part. Reacting is blurting something out in a meeting. It's having your face blurt out before your mouth does. How many of you have faces that say a whole lot more than your mouth ever does? You're not real good at playing poker. In fact, I've been told I should never play poker. So I don't have a poker face, but I still need to be able to pause my face. I need to be able to stop before I yell at my child just because I've had a bad day. I need to be able to pause before I regret something because I acted or spoke too soon. So pausing affords us the ability to move our thought processes from that reactive part of our brain called the amygdala to the more intentional part of our brain, that prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where our executive functioning lives. Those are things like rational thought, emotional control, considering consequences. It's the last part of our brains to develop, and yet it's one of the most important. It's highly important as we think about communicating change. So we want to pause and remember that our brain needs time to make that little switch. We also want to pause and consider, how do our team members, how might they be reacting to this change itself? So before I start to jump to say something in response to my team member or to a physician or to my colleague, I want to think about the fact that they're sharing something from their perspective. So I want to then, after I have paused, not only recognize that they are coming from a different walk of life, they have had different life experiences and different educational experiences, and they just have a different personality than I do. So then I need to perform what I call communication CPR. That is performing communication with candor, recognizing positive intent, and always maintaining an air of respect. So let's talk about candor. Candor is being honest without oversharing. Candor is accepting both the positive and the negative. It's speaking about both the positive and the negative. Now, I'm not talking about coming off as fake or oversharing. I'm not talking about being blubbering and, letting all of your emotions be worn on your sleeve, or crying because something is apparently, is touching you emotionally, because sometimes days are hard and we just feel like crying. So I'm not talking about being sugarcoating or being fake. I'm not talking about letting your emotions get the best of you, but I'm talking about being real and being honest. And if you are afraid of something, say it, name it. It's okay to normalize the discomfort that we feel when going through change. In fact, I had a practice recently convert from one medical record to another. We're moving towards a system-wide electronic medical record. And as this practice went through their change, the practice manager really, really wanted to be there for her patients. She wanted to be there in the waiting room, helping them to understand that there was a transition and helping support her team, because she could explain to the patients that there might be a wait. And she really had really good intentions, but she was really anxious about the change itself. The change threw her a little bit. And what she soon realized is that she was better off not being in that waiting room. She normalized the fact that it was uncomfortable for her, that she was better off working behind the scenes, sending someone who was a little bit better at masking their emotions, a little bit better at accepting the change, out into the waiting room to have that interaction with the patients. And she took care of things more behind the scenes. That's okay. That's perfectly acceptable. And what great self-awareness. It's okay, like I said, to say, I understand you might be nervous about this change. Here's what I think is going to go well. Here's what I'm nervous about too. It's okay to have those conversations with your teams. The other thing that's really important for your teams is to be able to answer 3 questions on a very consistent basis. Why are we going through this change? What can I expect of this change? And what's in it for me? So why are we going through this change organizationally? What's the big idea? What are we getting at? What can I expect? What are the milestones? What's it going to look like next month after we make this change? What's my job going to look like? Am I going to get downsized? And what's in it for me? Why do I want to make this change? All of those are important questions to be asking of and being able to answer for our team, because they're asking it in their minds, even if they're not asking it right in there out loud. The second step to CPR is to assume positive intent. Remember that anything that anyone says makes perfect sense to the person who's saying or doing it. The fact that I don't understand what they're saying, the fact that I'm confused by that emotional reaction, the fact that I think that's craziness is my problem. It's not theirs. It's my job as their leader. It's my job as someone who recognizes a difference to realize that that difference is okay and to help meet them where they are at, knowing that they're not coming from a place of harm. They're coming from a place of confusion or fear or sadness or concern that their job might be at stake. So I encourage you, and I encourage all leaders, to make a list of pros and cons before you ever announce a change. Make a list by standing in that team member's shoes. What are the pros and cons for the front office? What are the pros and cons for a physician? What are the pros and cons of this change for my nursing staff? And I'm not saying that you're going to publish them or that they need to be neat and perfect and pretty. They're just a way of getting yourself into their minds, helping yourself to understand where they might be coming from before you ever encounter that emotional reaction that they might have. I'll tell you a story of several years ago. I was working in a pulmonary practice and I was in charge of the front office, and we needed to go through an appointment type consolidation. I don't know about you all, but appointment types can get really prolific and it can be really hard to rein physicians back in, or staff or nursing staff or any other group of team members around the need to consolidate those appointment types. But having a consolidated appointment type set helps to get the right patient in the right place on a typical basis. Well, here's what happened in this scenario. About 2 weeks after go live, I had a physician come to me absolutely livid. He had a number of his patients who were ending up in follow-up slots instead of hospital follow-up slots. Now, I could have looked at him and said, no big deal. They're the same length of time. Why do you care? It's just the difference of one word. Give it a break. But I didn't. I did take the time to listen to him. I was a little bit fearful. I was certainly defensive because of his mannerisms, and he was so angry and upset, and I didn't feel like I had done anything wrong. I didn't feel like my team had done much wrong. They had just inadvertently picked the wrong type, and they may not have even known that that patient was coming from the hospital. But here's the thing. That physician explained to me that at the time, the medical records weren't talking to one another. So the patient who was in the hospital was on a different medical record than when they got back to the practice, and they were on their practice-based medical record. And so medications were miscommunicated. They might be on a dosage change. They might have had one type of medication exchanged for another. And it was that physician's job to get that patient back on track so that that patient knew which ones to stop taking, which ones to start taking, which colored pills and which times, and which, all of the questions that go with the confusion that someone who's on multiple medications and who has medication changes at a time when things are a little bit out of control for them because they're in the hospital, that can be really challenging. And that physician also knew that other patients on his schedule that morning were getting cancer diagnoses. They were anticipating and nervous about those, and he certainly didn't want to be late. So it wasn't that the physician was just upset about the word hospital being in front of his appointment type. It wasn't that he was just mad that his schedule didn't look the way he wanted it to. It was that he was concerned about his patients. And I hadn't stopped to think about that. I hadn't stopped to think about his perspective. But I'll tell you what, every conversation I've had since about appointment types, I really try to consider that perspective because it's an important one. The third step in any conversation is to maintain respect. And that is one thing, despite the fact that he was really upset, and despite the fact that I was defensive, we maintained respect for one another. So when you are having a conversation that might feel uncomfortable, it's important to make sure that your team member the physician, any other stakeholder that you are interacting with never loses dignity. Even if you have to have a constructive conversation about behavior that needs to stop, even if you need to perform corrective action with someone or what we might call disciplinary action, still let them maintain their dignity because they're humans. And that can be a real intentional conversation to have. It can cause you to have to be real intentional about your word choice, really intentional about your body language and the way that your voice is carrying, but be thoughtful about that. Recognize that you don't know everything, and I don't know everything. So demonstrate intellectual humility by using words like, help me understand why you come from that perspective. Help me understand what you're trying to say. Those words have been so important to my career because they help me to put myself in a position of truly listening, as opposed to just waiting for my turn to talk so that I can convince them that I'm right. So as we think back to the change reaction curve, remember that when a change is introduced, most people go through 4 stages, some of them faster than others, but they go through denial and then resistance, then exploration and commitment. So if you think about that change that we talked about a little earlier, I invite you to jump back in the comments with me again. What stage are most of your team members in? Are they in denial or resistance, or are they ready to explore and commit to that change? Where are they? Let's talk about that for just a couple moments in the chat. And as we do, let's think about the fact that there are predictable reactions to change. And some of those predictable reactions can lead to failed change efforts because they're not thoughtful, mindful, intentional responses. They're simply reactions. So team members might be feeling a sense of ownership that just went away. Maybe they feel like a change is being forced on them, or that they're finding themselves in victim mode. Maybe a team member doesn't understand the change. They don't know what it is, or they don't think it's a big deal. Maybe someone just doesn't have the capacity for change. They might be overwhelmed by all that is on their plate. So it's really important for us as leaders to recognize that there are predictable reactions to change and that we can help our team members by helping them to respond instead of to react to change. And we can do that by creating awareness of the change, by encouraging adoption, by coaching those team members, and by reinforcing that change once it is upon us. And what you may notice is that there are 4 very specific steps and that they align very well with the 4 stages of the change reaction curve. So as we move from reaction to response, we can change that individual's emotional state around the change that they are going to have to eventually accept. So as leaders, when we are encountering someone who is in denial, we want to create awareness of the change. Why is it important? What is the change itself? When we are talking to someone who is in a state of resistance, we want to encourage adoption, and there are a lot of ways to do that. Once someone has found themselves in a state of exploration, as their leader, we can manage and coach them to continue to explore. And then once they have committed, we can reinforce and celebrate that commitment to the change. So let's talk about each of these just for a moment. And this is a very high-level example of a toolkit. And I am glad to share with you greater detail, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But basically, as we walk through each of these levels of the change reaction curve, each of these stages in change reaction, we can find questions that the leader can ask of themselves to prepare themselves to talk to someone who's in denial, and then very specific keys and tips and tactics that that individual can encounter or can embrace and can share with their team. So as the leader asks themselves, does this person understand the business reason for the change? Do they know how it will impact them? Well, they can encounter that person who is in denial by offering communication, frequently asked questions and answers. They can provide those milestones so that that team member knows what's coming. For someone who is in resistance, the leader can prepare themselves to have a conversation with that individual by making sure that they know the skills and resources that are available. or that they are needed for that particular change. They can ask themselves, does this individual who's resisting have doubts or a negative perception of the change? And in order to be able to counteract those responses or those reactions, the leader can provide resources. They can deprioritize things that are on their plate that maybe that team member doesn't have to have on their plate anymore. Maybe they are overwhelmed and we need to take things off of their plate. They can ask for input to encourage buy-in so that that change reaction is more about ownership and less about victim. As someone is in exploration, as a leader, we can coach them. Do they know what success looks like? Can they confidently demonstrate that behavior? If not, we can provide support. We can remove obstacles and encourage best practices. And as we move into commitment, we can reinforce. We can help that individual understand the impact on the business. We can help them by showing them recognition. Have they received that recognition for a job well done? If not, let's make sure we're sharing data and celebrating. Let's make sure we're communicating about the success, because every milestone is an opportunity for success. We don't have to wait till we get to the finish line. We can celebrate at mile marker 1 and mile marker 2 and mile marker 3. The marathon is a lot longer, but every mile under our belt is worthy of celebration. So as I said, this is just the basics of a very much larger toolkit with more in-depth questions and more in-depth suggestions. If you are interested in receiving this, I will have my email and my website at the end of the slides, and I am certainly glad to send this out to you. You're welcome to drop your email address in the chat function, and we'll make sure we capture it, and I'll get that document out to you. But this is a great tool that we can then share and we can use to further our own exploration around change reaction. So today we started by talking about self-reflection. We started by reflecting ourselves, because that's where leadership truly begins. We then moved to making sure that our team feels psychologically safe, that they feel comfortable acting and speaking up and asking questions. We also talked about the way that they can communicate with us. We want to make sure that they are communicating with candor just as we are. We want to make sure that we are assuming their positive intent and that we are respecting them as individuals. We also thought about each of the stages of the change reaction curve. We examined team members' perspectives as they move from denial to resistance to exploration and then to commitment. And finally, we talked through that toolkit, identifying tactics and techniques, questions we can ask ourselves as leaders before we get in front of a team member or a stakeholder about that change, identifying where they might find themselves so that we can ask ourselves appropriate questions and be prepared for that conversation. So as with any time that I present or share information, I hope that today is just the beginning. I hope that you will continue the conversation, either with me personally, and as I said, there is my website and my email address, and I am certainly glad to answer questions if you think of something later. As I mentioned, we will have about 5 or 10 minutes of Q&A now. And I also hope you continue this conversation with your colleagues, your friends, even family members, because families go through change too. I have a teenager who's going through the transition to high school. And by all means, most of these techniques, most of these reactions are things that we encounter not just in life, not just in our work life, but also in our home life. And so before we move into our last section of Q&A, I want to tell you one quick story. 2 summers ago, my family spent several days on the beach at the Outer Banks. We spent the first few days of the week watching another family down the beach as they played and learned to use a stand-up paddleboard. It was clear that the family had rented one, and we had never used a stand-up paddleboard before, but we thought, what a great opportunity. Maybe we should rent one too. Several days into the trip, we decided it was on. We were going to rent a stand-up paddleboard. I can tell you I felt like quite the athlete, which I am not much of an athlete, but I felt like one as I carried the oversized board into the water. And I steadied the board just past the surf, hopped up and sat on my knees. It felt stable and well balanced beneath me, and I paddled around on my knees for a while, and then it came time to test my athleticism by standing up. Well, like I said, I'm not much of an athlete, so when it comes to tests, I should probably stick to academics. With a shriek and a laugh, I fell into the water because what happened was a wave came. Not a giant wave, not a big one, but just a ripple, just enough to send me toppling off the side of the board. Now, change initiatives are often like my first few days on that paddleboard. There's the planning before they happen, preparation of ourselves and our team members. And on the first day of change, it can feel a little wobbly, but maybe it's sustainable. And then something in the environment changes. And in the blink of an eye, what was going so well suddenly isn't. And we find ourselves falling off the board. We find ourselves wet and laughing. The wind knocked out of us for a moment, maybe. Hopefully, we aren't too injured, but we get back up. We adjust and we practice, and we find what works for ourselves and our teams. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and I hope that you will spend a little more time with me as we jump into our Q&A. So with that, thank you very much.
Hey everyone, this is Daniel Williams with MGMA. I want to thank Katie so much. I know that we promised several times in there we were going to do a Q&A, and unfortunately we're already 6 minutes over, and this room is going to close in just a minute, but I'm so glad that so many of you were able to give your information to Katie so she can respond to you. We'll have the transcript to her so she can respond to each one of you. Thank you so much for being an amazing audience, and want to thank you for this. And remember to visit the Solution Center to find partners that will address the topic in today's session. Y'all take care. Thank you again, Katie. You're amazing.